Hey pillars, and welcome back to a new video. Now this is a training video on how to get fast in 2025 and my top 3 tips. And I think this is going to serve a lot of riders just because whether you're, an amateur or someone that's been riding a long time, there's always new things that you can do in your cycling regimen that will make you faster. And if you're new to the channel, hello. But if you're not, then you can clearly see that I've made a lot of gains recently on the bike. And I do want to share my top 3 tips. Just really simple. I will be doing a lot more training videos like this one, so stay tuned for that. But I thought let's get 3 actionable tips that will help you get faster on the bike and will actually help you have a good, enjoyable 2025 season, especially with spring and summertime right around the corner. So let's jump into tip number 1. Now, my initial first tip on getting faster on the road bike would be to optimize your body position and your weight as well. And I will touch up on both categories and where you actually should be putting your energy in. So in terms of, let's talk about weight, because I think that's a pretty standard thing. And I know it can be somewhat taboo in cycling. And this doesn't mean that you have to get as lean or as low of a BMI. Obviously, that's not for every cyclist or recommended as well, depending on your goals and just your body type, etc. But in terms of what type of riding you're doing, if you're somewhere where it's very mountainous, there is hill climbs, the group ride does rolling terrain, there's a group ride that does hills. Obviously, depending on your goals is, do you really want to finish with the top riders? Is it more just a social ride? Is it one of those rides where people ride at their own intensity and there's a regroup at the top of the climb? Then weight obviously can come down to what your goals are, but it's just something to be noted that between 2 to 3 kilograms can improve your climbing speed by 1 to 2%. So you can see that if you lose, 10 pounds or even 5 kgs, it can make a big difference in your climbing. And obviously a ride isn't just 1 hour, especially when we're talking about group rides. So you can see, from a very small perspective over the course of a long ride, it can actually allow you to be a little bit fresher depending on if you can shave some weight. But in terms of optimizing your body position, that doesn't really necessarily involve weight loss. So what that means is basically getting as aerodynamic as possible, and that will allow you to conserve energy and actually go faster because you can basically keep a higher speed in the group or even by yourself without having to exert the same amount of energy. So aero is one of those things that have been preached so much in the industry in the past 2 to 3 years. And I wasn't necessarily an early adopter. Obviously, there's a lot of common sense stuff like getting the frontal area of yourself on the bike as, tucked in as possible. But obviously that takes a lot of training to actually hold that position because it's a little bit less relaxed. And it's something that you have to consciously make an effort to practice. So a very practical tip that you can start right now after watching this video is just trying to work on your aerodynamics. And a very simple tip would be bending your elbows and trying to get your torso as flat as possible. And just by, reducing the frontal area, you can improve and decrease aerodynamic drag by about 30%, making you significantly faster. And the only downside is just you will have to tweak and work on this position and actually be conscious that, hey, I'm going to really try to get as aero as possible on the bike. But over time, you'll see that you actually conserve a lot of energy over a long ride. Another tip you can play around with, depending if you want to do this, is that you can adjust the saddle tilt and reach of your saddle. And it actually is documented that a slight forward tilt engages your core and legs, and that allows for a better power output. So you got to be careful just because if you're not too confident with your, let's say, bike fitting abilities, you don't want to put yourself in a position that might lead to an injury. By having your saddle slightly forward, some riders actually, improve their power output depending on if they can open their hips. So you really got to figure it out. Even I'm not an expert when it comes to bike fitting positions, and something that you really have to tweak around and listen to your body and do actionable tests that you can track, but definitely something to potentially consider, because if you find a position that allows you to produce more power, then obviously you're going to go faster. Now, also with most of my videos that I've made, I like to really focus on actionable things that don't require a lot of money. But when it comes to cycling, obviously you have gear. So any type of clothing that is going to flap in the wind is going to produce drag. So my tip would be to get as form-fitting clothing as you can, obviously without breaking the bank, and that will reduce drag in the wind, especially during windy conditions. One thing I've been experiencing as of recently is I'm losing more weight. So a lot of my old jerseys that fit very tight are now a little bit baggy, and I'm not very content with how much drag they're producing. But Basically, a fitted jersey can reduce, drag by 5 to 10 watts. Obviously, not a huge deal, but like I said, these are all micro things that lead to a big net savings in terms of making you faster. So, tight clothing, always a pro. Now, to end the section of this tip is basically trying to get as small in the frontal area and as efficient as you can on the bike will allow you to save a lot of energy and make you faster. And if you can actionably make some steps towards losing a couple pounds, then you will be faster as well when it comes to elevation. But more so, I want to focus on the body position just because, weight is something that I will touch up on in other training videos just because I think it deserves a whole video on itself. And as you can see, I look a lot different from some of my previous videos in the last year or two. So I do want to touch up on it because I think it's huge when it comes to cycling. Obviously, living in more mountainous regions now, living in Greece, very different from riding in, let's say, North America. Obviously, what part of North America, but more flatter regions. So I'm just saying it plays a big role, but body position is one of those things, no matter what size you are, you can improve that. Obviously, I think when you're a little bit leaner, it's easier to really tighten yourself up because obviously there's less mass. But everyone can actually, bend their arms in, get as tight as possible, and it doesn't necessarily require you to get new handlebars or to even turn your shifters in. It's just actively. When I'm on group rides, not every rider actually does it, so it's one of those things that it's a very good baseline to start. And if you actually find that you enjoy doing it, it's improving your cycling, then we can talk about equipment. But I don't like to preach equipment right off the start because I think there's actionable things you can do that are basically free. Now, my second tip, and I think a lot of people are going to be like, yeah, we know this already, is to train smarter. And that's with intervals, strength work, and climbing. Now, climbing, most riders do genuinely try to avoid it just because it is one of those things that if you do not train for it, you're not going to have the best time. So even with myself, I'm going to, in this 2025 season, really try to do hills, like mountain passes, at least 2 to 3 times a week. And I'm thinking maybe on Tuesdays, Thursdays, I'm going to just do those HIIT workouts. And the one thing I love with climbing is that when you have, a 5-6% gradient climb, you can't do sub, 200 watts even. It really pushes you to work. And you have no time to really get off the gas. So it's a great automatic trainer. And then obviously if you throw some intervals, some 3x10s, even like very basic. I'm just talking very basic workouts on climbing days. You will see the benefits on group rides. You will see the benefits on solo rides. You will see the benefits just overall in your riding because you're actually doing resistance training and you're going to force your legs to get stronger. Now, one thing I will not necessarily talk about when it comes to getting faster in terms of training smarter is sprint repeats. Now, you can do it. I just think for most beginners, it's something that requires, sprinting is a skill, bad technique, bad bike handling, depending on how you sprint out of the saddle. You just don't want to have a crash unnecessarily. So I think it's one of those things that takes time to get better at. So I more preach hill climbing for training from that perspective, just because it's a lot easier. You can't really, you can crash going uphill, but the odds of that is a little bit, if you crash going uphill at like 10 kilometers an hour, 15 kilometers an hour, like, you need to work on your bike handling compared to a sprint where, that's understandable to some degree if you're new at cycling. So I like to really preach hill climbing, and it's one of those things that I will make sure I'm doing this season 100% because it will just force you to be stronger. Another thing you can do to train smarter as well is that if you don't live in a super climby area like I used to, then doing threshold work, which just means like 75% of your max on an indoor trainer, like the one I got behind, is super good. Just because you don't have to worry about traffic, you don't have to worry about road conditions, you can really just focus. Luckily now that I live in a mountainous region, I will very much utilize, the 20, 30 kilometers of climbing at 5% that I have in my backyard. So I'm very thankful and lucky that I have that. But if you don't, I would say a trainer is a great way to do that. Sprinting, like I said, I wouldn't really focus on it. Now, strength work as well can help. But, most likely I like to tend to recommend focusing on actionable things you can do physically on the bike. And then there's some, percentages that we can make up in the gym or in terms of doing strength work off the bike. but I would say find climbs that you can do hill repeats on if you don't live in a mountainous region. If you live in a mountainous region, then you should get really fit. And if not, you can always use the trainer. So obviously a very boring tip because, you got to do the work if you want to get faster, but the consistency aspect of doing the work over a long enough time, you will see the benefits. So even myself, I will be making videos of kind of like maybe doing an FTP test in the mountains, like see where my 20-minute FTP is, and then do a whole season of training and then retest it maybe around, summertime, July even, to see where I am form-wise. But yeah, climbs are just, if you actually do it and you don't avoid them, you don't reroute your route, you will become stronger 100%. Now, my final tip, and necessarily not, I'm not really a gearhead or super techie, but I am also. So it's kind of hard. It's like the whole aerodynamics thing. Eventually, when you do start optimizing all these key, characteristics, you're going to be like, okay, well, oh, and also in this video, if you haven't figured it out too, you need a power meter if you're going to do any of that training, just to be able to keep your parameters in terms of zones and whatnot. So tip number 3 is reduce rolling resistance. And you might be asking, what is rolling resistance? Now, in gravel cycling, it's huge. Tires is everything, and just testing different tires for different gravel, it's huge. Now, the reason why rolling resistance matters in a very simple term is you don't want your tires to be hard to push initially, meaning that, they should flow basically. And rolling resistance is kind of hard to understand initially. So I'm going to try to break it down so it's very simple to follow along. So there's a mix of what type of tires are you using, what type of tubes are you using, and then the pressure that you're putting into said tires. So I wrote down some common mistakes that are slowing you down. So either riding with underflated tires, and obviously we're talking about road, we're not talking about gravel or even mountain biking, but underflated tires, which means too soft, you're going to have more friction with the road, making it harder for you to push and obviously to keep speed. And obviously speeds in road cycling are a lot faster than gravel and even in mountain biking. So that's one thing. Using old or slow tires, just cheap stock, worn out tires, are not going to be fast. Like, just logically, if they don't have a good, casing and all that, like all the material used on that said tire, like there is going to be resistance because it's not an efficient compound being used. So just cheap tires, not going to be fast, common sense. And then using heavy inner tubes. So standard tubes, which I still am using, are thicker and stiffer, which means that there's energy lost when the tire compresses. So I do have some tips, and I actually will be making a video because I've heard a lot about TPU inner tubes. It's like those pink tubes. I'll put a picture on screen, and I've yet to test them. So I'm actually going to be testing some of those because they are significantly lighter, which obviously is good too from a weight perspective. I'm not a weight weenie, but if we can get the weight down, that's obviously a net positive. So I have some tips to reduce rolling resistance, but just basically good quality tires that are tested. I like to use Continental GPs, GP5000s I have right now that I'm going to have to get new ones. And then the inner tube is something I do want to test to actually see if it's just a hype thing or if it actually changes the ride quality, which I am excited to do. The reason why I'm not running tubeless right now, which I could, is just I don't like the faff of it. It's just too much of a headache, and I don't necessarily have the willpower to have sealant and everything and deal with that at home. So rather just use tubes. Very simple, tried and true. I have yet luckily only had one flat while riding in Greece, so I'm very thankful for that. But basically, these are the tips that help with your rolling resistance and make you ride faster. Is basically pump your tires properly. So check before every ride that you have proper PSI. Depending on your weight, you'll have to run the calculations, but 80 to 100 PSI. Because too soft is slow and too hard, which becomes bumpy and less grippy just because it's really inflated. So I like to check my tire pressure usually every 2 days. I don't do it every single ride, but it's super important. Upgrading, like I said previously, to higher performance tires. Obviously that makes sense because those tires have less friction. They're designed to have less friction, which means more speed for the same power. So I always like to use Continental. I've always used Continental. Pretty good for puncture resistance compared to Victorias, which I've used in the past. So I'm always someone that has preached Continentals. And then TPU, or latex inner tubes, super interesting because they're relatively cheap and they're super lightweight as well. So if it's lightweight and it reduces rolling resistance, I'm super curious to actually see, because right now I'm looking at my screen. It says that TPU inner tubes can save 5 to 6 watts per wheel, making you 1 to 2 kilometers faster with zero extra effort. So is it cap? Is it not cap? I'm super excited to actually see. So I did order a couple inner tubes, and I think it'll be nicer to have that on the bike. So the weight, because the difference is like the standard inner tube, I think is like 100 grams, where these are like 24, 34 grams. So like 1/3 of the weight. So obviously that plays a role. So I'm excited to test those out. And the third section of like rolling resistance is one of those things where I feel like I put it on here because I think for the average, cyclist, the only thing I would say that most people still might have not tested from what I've seen in other countries as well is like TPU inner tubes. Definitely not something that's totally promoted, but obviously better quality tires is. But you would be surprised that for beginners, even these are tips that I think are super important, because a slow tire, like a tire that's $20, is not the same as a tire that's $90 in terms of rolling resistance. So 1 to 3 kilometers faster, I think we would all appreciate. So that's why I put it up there. But I still think tip number one is probably very, very easy that you can do right after this video. And then tip number 2 is something that you should be doing in the background. And then 3 is kind of like tweaking around with some of the equipment that you already have, for example, that you will need to upgrade regardless, because even with my tires, I'm gonna have to upgrade them this season. So depending on how much riding you're doing, you can definitely play around with different setups. Now, another thing that should have made this list, but I decided to keep it for another video, is fueling and fueling on the bike. Obviously, if you're not fueled properly, how are you going to maintain 35 kilometers an hour for 6 hours if after the first hour you don't consume anything on the bike? So fueling, nutrition, that type of stuff, I will be making a separate video. So if you do want to see videos like that, leave it in the comment section down below, because I do have some video ideas on that topic. But in terms of everything I discussed today, I did want to give a quick overview of the most efficient things you can do and start actually making a plan for 2025. Because yes, it's February. Maybe the New Year's resolution in terms of being on the bike hasn't been the best, but it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, all that matters is what can you do now consciously. The first thing we can all do is work on our position. That's something that since I've started cycling at like 15, 16 years old, I've always mentally thought about. Now, it is hard when you don't have, let's say, aero testing or even bike fit. Like, I don't know why I said aero testing, but bike fitting, where you're getting a bike fit every season or every 2 times a season for racing. But, with technology getting better, I know there's some AI bike fitting tools available as well. So there are some stuff that I still want to test. I will slowly test, but even just simply taking your phone and videotaping yourself while you're on the trainer is a very easy way to see, what positions work and what positions can you tweak and what do you kind of look like. And it's the thing that initially it's not going to be super scientific, but over time of repetition, you will start seeing trends. So I think a lot of these things I'm going to be touching up on future videos. I just wanted to make this video because I thought it was an interesting topic. Number 2, when it comes to training, I can say for myself too, I've been more focused about getting on the bike. And I would say that if you're already struggling early on in 2025, getting on the bike, do not focus on training unless you want to use it kind of like as something to force you, and you have some events planned and you want to show up with a good form. That's different. But if you're struggling to even get on the bike, then focus on just getting the bike and figuring out a way to get on the bike so you can train. Right? The biggest thing I see people do is that they get burnt out. They have this whole training plan, and after 2 weeks, they don't even want to touch the bike. So I usually tend to gravitate towards more of a gradual approach, and then from there fine-tuning it for events or for structured training. But definitely you will get faster with the more structured training that you do, because you will naturally lose weight, you will naturally build muscle, you will naturally get fitter on the bike, which will make you undoubtedly faster. And then the third thing, definitely look at the tires that you're using. Look at the wear. Is there cracks? Is it a cheap tire? Is it a more expensive tire? What tubes are you using? I will do a whole video series on that because I think it's super important. And I think it's a video that even I underlook sometimes just because I'm not super gear heady. But yeah, say that 3 times fast. But I do want to touch up on that more in this 2025 season, because there's all these small things that even I sometimes forget that can make a huge difference. So I do want to make more tech related videos for the 2025 season. So if you guys did find this video insightful, took something good away from it, then just smash a like. If not, totally okay. It just helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment down below of what tips you would recommend to new cyclists or even avid cyclists for the 2025 season that maybe I should touch up on in a future video, or that I forgot that you think is super important. Follow me on Strava and Instagram, links in the description. And until the next one, keep on pedaling.